Question is that the motion be agreed to. Dr Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and it's my pleasure to take a short call on this piece of legislation that Labor is supporting. And I think it is important that, that this bill does pass through this House and be enacted into law, because many people are relying on this being sorted so they can get on with their lives, that the Minister alluded to in his speech. I think when we sit back in a few years' time and look at the number of pieces of bespoke legislation that we've had to put in place to address what has happened in Canterbury since September 2010, the statute book itself is going to tell a story about the amount of change that had happened. What we're talking about here isn't an isolated incident. It's quite simple legislation. Where the land is moved, we need to make sure that the legal boundaries of that land can move to be with it as well. But that's right, Mr Cosgrove, the earth has moved. So, Mr Speaker, what we have is that we have some material that does need to be put in place, and this applies to 11,000 properties in the Canterbury area. So this is no small undertaking, the number of homeowners who will be impacted by this legislation and need to get this sorted. One of the things, Mr Speaker, that the Minister who spoke about is that we need to get this legislation passed and put it in the parcel of legislation that is required in order for people to get on with their lives. And I commend Minister Upston for taking that approach, and I think she should have a wee chat with some of her Cabinet colleagues about the need to fasten up processes so people can get on with their lives in other parts in Canterbury and other parts of their lives as well. So I would ask her to consider having that talk. One of the changes that submitters did come to Select Committee and ask for was that there be more robustness put around the disputes resolution clauses within this legislation, because there will still be instances where people don't agree in terms of where it's deemed a property boundary has moved to. That wasn't included. The committee made a decision not to include that change. I think that's something that we need to watch very carefully to see if that is something that we are going to have to change in terms of this legislation, whether we are going to have to put greater provision in there to deal with disputes, because the last thing that we want to be doing is passing a piece of legislation that allows people to get their insurance claims settled but then ties them up in litigation around where their property actually is, which will mean the very point that they want to get on with, which is rebuilding their home and their lives, will be further delayed. So I am signalling that that could well be something that we're back in this House amending in the not too distant future. Mr Speaker, the properties that were affected where the boundaries have moved the most, by and large, are in the most, as you'd expect, in some of the most earthquake impacted parts of the city. So I think it is, as this bill passes into law, and we are coming up to the 6th anniversary of the earthquake that started this sequence of events in Canterbury, that it is worth acknowledging what people all throughout the city have been through, and particularly the parts of the city that have been most impacted by the earthquakes and the damage to property and the inability of people to get on with their lives as a consequence of that. I will also note that this legislation had to change, as the Minister noted, because of the Valentine's earthquake of this year. It's a little bit horrifying as a Cantabrian to read a piece of legislation forecasting earthquakes going out to 2022. I hope that's not a provision of the Act that we have to use, and that the February Valentine's Day this year was the last of the major sequence that we will see. And I just feel the need to touch wood about now, Mr Speaker. But Mr Speaker, Labor is happy to support this bill. We're happy to support any measure that would let Cantabrians get on with their lives. And in fact, we'd like to see far more of them. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I call Scott